thank you all so much for your testimony. And I appreciate getting your perspectives on this. I want to start with GDPR. I mentioned that in my opening remarks. And let me ask you, are each of you involved in some way in the EU? Are your companies involved in some way in the EU? Show of hands is fine. Okay, so 2 of you are. Mr. Trivedi, you're trying to decide if you are or not.
Only to say that we're not a company, so no business in the EU, but we're a nonprofit that's certainly
and
tracking.
Mr. Lee, likewise. As we look at this, and as I mentioned, our friends in the EU know they went a little bit too far. But companies already have these protocols in place to meet the GDPR standard. So as you look at what they have done in the EU, and Canada has a law, and New Zealand has a law, and Australia has a law, all protecting their citizens in the virtual space. Mr. Lee, start with you and just go down the line. What should be the lessons that we learned, and what should we take away from the GDPR experience? Go ahead and just very quickly so I can work on through my questions.
The things that I think they got right do deal with some of the more technical aspects of making sure that you are having the programs that you need in place and that they meet the risk that you are facing. So it's not a prescriptive necessarily standard, but it's you have to assess and report. And then when there is a data breach, you have to report that to the data authority for that country.
So their assessment reporting mechanism,
yes.
You would say they got it right. Mr. Kaplan?
Thank you, Senator. That's a great question. I would say from a macro level, the things that they got right are sort of a uniform standard. Okay. Regulatory complexity across multiple markets just increases costs, and from a cybersecurity perspective, the sources that and the resources that are dedicated to responding to incidents should be operationally responding to incidents rather than looking at regulatory compliance.
As I say, we need one set of rules for the entire internet ecosystem with one regulator. Yeah.
Predictability and lessening regulatory complexity
yes.
is one of the
good thing, isn't it, Mr. Trivedi?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think the first lesson is something you highlighted, which is moving swiftly to establish that uniform standard. That's something we should emulate. I think it's worth saying GDPR has probably not been strong enough on data minimization, that I think the regime we're hopefully working towards here in the United States could do it better. I think GDPR arguably gives too much deference to companies to decide what minimization means, and I think while we should have sort of a reasonableness thing and flexibility, we need a strong and flexible approach. I think there's an opportunity for an American approach that's different and that works for us.
Okay, Mr. Parker?
I would say the emphasis on reasonableness, proportionality, and consent is very similar to what a lot of the states have done already. See the similarities between those two, which obviously was pointed out is a little bit different than what the proposal we're talking about now at the federal level is. But just based on what I've also, some feedback from members we've had is there has definitely been an issue with conflicting interpretations over time from the national data protection authorities within the EU that's causing problems for businesses that are doing, work across the EU, different jurisdictions. But also there's the potential, and this is I think relevant for us here, that there's overlap between the AI Act and the GDPR. And in some cases, those areas of overlap are going to get resolved one way or another, but it's causing some confusion. So. And
digital marketing and digital services and the overlap there. Let me, I want to go to the data minimization issue. And again, just down the line, Mr. Lee, starting with you, what is your opinion of data minimization as a security principle in this debate?
I think it has to be integral.
Okay.
If we're going to reduce identity crimes, we're going to have fewer victims, we have to reduce the supply of data that can be abused by individuals if it's stolen or even if it's just accidentally exposed. Okay. If you don't have it, You can't expose it.
So you tie the two?
I do.
Yeah, okay. As you said, data breaches are the fuel. So that ties in, Mr. Kaplan.
Senator, from a macro perspective, I think data minimization is an increasingly useful principle, especially in lessening the attack surface, particularly for those companies that are doing business with consumer-focused data. To that end, there's also where we think that, legitimate and broad, not broad, but targeted permissible purposes like protecting the information can be critical, but minimization can be an important tool.
So you would segment it?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Trivedi?
Thank you, Senator. I would say data minimization is an essential part of data security safeguards, central to it, for the reasons that other witnesses have highlighted as well, which is to say the attack surface is lessened when you sort of are intentional about collecting only what you need. You can't exfiltrate or hack what isn't there in the first place.
All right. Mr. Parker?
Yeah, I would say there is a bit of a difference between data minimization as an operational principle and a policy principle. So certainly from an operational standpoint, this definitely plays a big role in data security. From a policy perspective, I know there's, the overall approach of having a set number of permissible purposes for collecting and processing data. It certainly could work. I know there's some questions out there about what about future-proofing this so that in the future, is that going to be too narrow? And do they cover what they need to now? Those are all legitimate questions, but certainly an interesting approach.
Great. Can I ask? Sure. Oh, Peter's here. So I didn't see him. Go ahead and go to him. I've got another question I want to ask.
Well, and I've got Senator Klobuchar on as well. You
Oh,
want to ask
okay.
us a question?
I do. I wanted to talk about China because we just enacted legislation to force ByteDance to divest from TikTok. And the data security threat from China is broader than just TikTok, and a more holistic approach rather than playing whack-a-mole is required on this. The problem goes beyond apps, and we know that China is using drones and cranes and potentially routers to spy on Americans. So how should Congress approach the broader data security threat from China, and what do you see as a good policy solution to this? Mr. Lee?
I'm just a humble victim advocate. But we do have to recognize that nation states, maybe not for the same reason as professional criminals, they want the information, and it's important that it is protected from whomever wants to misuse it for whatever reason they want to use it. China is certainly a nation state that has great capabilities. We know that they have a lot of data about individuals for intel purposes. We have to assume there are other countries, friends and foes, that do the same. So an approach for data protection needs to be universal in its approach to whomever is acquiring the information.
Mr. Kaplan?
Senator, yeah, the threat from China is something that we are tracking every day on a regular basis, both the threat with exfiltrating information to China, but also other malign nation states that are looking to leverage sort of data within the United States. As a cybersecurity company, we're principally focused on the security of the networks and information systems upon which that data relies. So broader policy sort of questions about how to deal more holistically with the problem may be outside of our purview. To that end, we would encourage strong cyber protections with regard to those systems and encourage information sharing with the federal government like we enjoy and we regularly partner in with regard to that threat.
Mr. Trivedi?
Thank you for the question. I think you're importantly highlighting the ways in which data security and data protection have a national security dimension. We've been talking about consumer protection, which is vital. We've been talking about people's privacy, but this is not all occurring just in the context of what's happening with our own borders. And as Mr. Kaplan mentioned, I think there are a number of nations in competition for one another's data, and there are costs to that. I would say, to answer your question about the right policy approach, at the top of the list should be establishing a federal data security and privacy protection standard, right? I think that's essential because it does all the things we've talked about, but also confers national security benefits on America as well.
Yeah, and certainly what was just mentioned is establishing that standard in the federal privacy framework we're talking about would go a long way to doing that. Certainly anything that's internet connected devices is a target for exploitation by nation-state actors. Implementing, certain encryption protocols in our industry, as I'm aware, is pretty important. Protecting those specific kind of devices. And I would say, though, as an additional side note, there's been also a large shift within our industry away from manufacturers in China and sourcing equipment there that could possibly have vulnerabilities. So I'd say, especially in the commercial sector, it's been near complete move away from those sources.
Great.